Thank you so much, Ty, for that introduction to the events, and thank you all for coming. It is a huge honor to be here to celebrate the career of one of the true giants in not only clinical psychology, but the field of psychology more generally, Alan Kazdin. So, as Ty mentioned, my name is Matt Nock. I was a graduate student of Alan's from 1998 to 2003, and it is a true honor to be here with you to celebrate Alan's career in this Festschrift. And since I'm back at Yale and among friends, I want to be honest, I'm not really clear what a Festschrift is. Many of us aren't. And so we have some events planned for the day. As Ty mentioned, we have an amazing series of speakers who are going to give presentations throughout the day. We also have a balloon artist who's going to be here shortly. Alan's kindergarten teacher, Miss Woodford, is going to come and read stories to us in a little while, and there's also going to be a tattoo artist in the break room during lunch, which costs quite a bit of money, so I hope you'll take advantage of that. Each of our speakers is going to, we had actually a long list of people who wanted to be here to present today. We only had one day to do this, so we have about 15 speakers who are going to present. We're going to limit each of the speakers to a 20-minute time slot, so we're going to present for about 15 minutes with a few minutes for questions, and it's going to be my job to be bad cop and try and keep us all on time. We're going to have each speaker come up and introduce themselves to try and maximize the amount of time they have to present. So I'm going to ask each speaker, when you come up to introduce yourself, let us know your connection to Alan if it's not clear to the audience already. And then the speakers they were asked to consider presenting some original research. We want this to really reflect Alan and his career, so there'll be some big conceptual talks. There'll be some methodological innovations. There'll be some empirical findings. There'll be likely some humor and some interesting stories throughout the day. So I'm going to go ahead, as Ty said, and get started. I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that we've been doing in my research lab focused on some new directions in the study of suicidal behavior. So I'm currently a professor of psychology at Harvard University. As I mentioned, I've been a student of Alan's for some time now, and I spend my time these days talking about and thinking about suicidal behavior. And what I want to share are what I think are some new directions in this area. And of course, by new directions, what I mean is using the WWAD approach, or WAD approach, to try and make advances. Any students of Alan's are familiar with this approach, as Ty was saying, generations of clinical psychologists. This is, of course, the what would Alan do approach to trying to move work forward. As Ty mentioned, to say just a few words about this approach and link it to some of Ty's comments, Alan has been for many years, I would argue, the most incisive thinker in the field of clinical psychology. A methodologist, as Ty said, he literally wrote the book on how to do research design in clinical psychology. By write the book, as Ty mentioned, Alan's written over 50 books on these topics, and these are the books that are used in virtually every clinical psychology program in the country, probably around the world. So Alan's methodological rigor and work has touched the lives of thousands and thousands of students who now are influenced by his thinking and his ideas about how to, as he says, force nature to reveal her secrets. He's also been a leader in the development of using science to better understand how to impact the lives of others and how to decrease the burden of mental disorders, improving the lives of not just clinical psychologists and clinical scientists, but families more generally. And beyond this, those of us who've been fortunate enough to work directly with Alan have been influenced by him in many other ways. He has an infectious passion for science and for clinical psychology and for helping others that has influenced and impacted so many of us who have worked with him. He also is a perennial dispenser of positive reinforcement for those who display desired behaviors, and an occasional planned ignorer of undesired behaviors, although very, very infrequently. And he's also been, for many of us, a model of what it means to be not only a clinical scientist, but a mentor for many, many, many years. And so in my own career as a psychologist, I've tried to, as I move through my scientific life, think back to, well, what would Alan do in different situations? And I found this really helpful in trying to make some advances in my own life and career. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work we do and how, just a few small examples of the thousands of ways that Alan's work has had an influence. My research these days is focused on the problem of suicide. By way of brief introduction, this is a problem that has perplexed the human mind for literally thousands of years, falling for a very long time in the domain of philosophical inquiry. It's only been the past century or so that scientists, physicians, psychologists have tried to understand and solve this problem, but it remains a big problem. It's still the 10th leading cause of all death in the US, responsible for more deaths each year around the world than all homicide, wars, genocide combined. We have made some progress over the years. We've identified some key risk factors. We have some promising treatments. But I would argue, and some of us would argue, that progress has been slow and in many ways really stagnant. I do have colleagues that disagree with this perspective, as is their want to do. As W. Edwards Deming has said, "In God we trust, all others must bring data." And so I brought a small piece of data to highlight the point. What this little figure shows is many leading causes of death have dropped precipitously over the past 100 years. Things like shown here in the bottom lines, deaths due to gastritis, pneumonia, tuberculosis, not shown here, accidents, cancers, and so on. As we've got better at science, at medicine, at psychological interventions, we've seen these causes of death decline. The suicide rate, though, is the same now as it was literally 100 years ago, so we haven't made the same kinds of advances. Why might this be? Alan has taught us over the years to identify gaps in our understanding and try and use new methods to try and bridge those gaps. There are many gaps in our understanding of suicide. One is due to this fact here. This is a finding from recent meta-analysis that we published looking at the past 50 years of research on studies trying to predict suicide and suicidal behaviors. What we see is that most studies have aimed at trying to understand and predict this problem using lab and clinic-based retrospective self-reports. So we bring people into our labs or clinics and ask them about, in the past when they were suicidal, why were they suicidal, what was happening at the time. We've done this because it's unethical to do otherwise. So if we want to study anxiety or depression or alcohol, we can bring people into our lab and induce those things. Ethically, we can't do that with suicide. We can't bring people into our lab and make them suicidal, which means we haven't been able to observe suicidal thoughts as they actually occur. This is different than virtually every other area of science. If we want to understand human vision or cognition, or we want to understand astronomy or chemical processes or ants, we observe those things directly. For suicide, we simply haven't been able to do that, and it's really limited our understanding. What would Alan do? Alan has told us that ideally these observations of people should be made in the natural settings in which they normally function. This is from his single case research design book. Also in its multiple editions, he's been saying for years we should do direct observation of people in their settings. How can we do that? Alan goes on in a more recent paper to say, well, we now have technology and smartphones and other devices that can provide new opportunities for monitoring people where they are in place. And he is, of course, right. We, over the past few years, have all become effectively cyborgs, right? We all have these digital appendages that we walk around with that collect information about us second by second, day after day. And this allows us to now do what my colleagues at Harvard Medical School, John Turos and J. Pionella, call digital phenotyping, or doing the moment-by-moment quantification of the individual level phenotype in situ, so in place, in the wild, using information from people's digital devices. This allows us to capture fine-grained dynamic changes, fluctuations in the phenomena of interest. In the case of suicide, it allows us to look at changes in people's thoughts and feelings and behaviors as they become depressed, as they become manic, as they move into a suicidal episode. This decreases the influence of recall bias. It allows us to, for suicide for the first time, to observe these processes as they're actually occurring out in the wild, rather than studying what happens in our research laboratories or clinical interview rooms. And using this approach, we can test existing theories using, for the first time, ecologically valid data. And I'm not going to show this here, but a lot of our current theories of suicide simply don't hold up when we use real-time monitoring data. And we can, I think more excitingly, collect never-before-available data and create new theories about why people may become suicidal, and achieve what I think of as a holy grail in this area, and that's trying to intervene with people in time and place before they become suicidal or before they make a suicide attempt. And so I want to share just a few quick examples of how this has looked, at least from our research group over the past few years. So what we've been doing in the past couple of years is finding people who say that they're having serious thoughts of suicide, and we put an app on their phone that administers quickie surveys to them 4 to 6 times a day, asking them about their desire to kill themselves, their intention to kill themselves, their ability to resist the urge to kill themselves. And initially what we do is just plot this out to see, when we really zoom in on people for the first time this closely, what do suicidal thoughts actually look like? So if we have a sample of people who say, I'm having serious thoughts of killing myself, is there stability, is there change in those thoughts? What I'm showing here is a slide that showed data from about 50 people. Each little rectangle is a different participant. On the horizontal axis is the passage of time, so this is a 1-month period. On the vertical axis is severity of suicidal ideation, basically adding up the 3 questions I showed on the previous slide. What you'll notice is there's a lot of variability here. Not all suicidal people experience suicidal thoughts the same. There seem to be differences. We literally printed these out and put them on the floor of our research lab, my postdocs and I, to see, do we see any different patterns in the data? And we stared at these, embarrassingly, for several hours and didn't see any patterns. If you do, please don't tell me, because we spent a lot of time on this. We then said, though, maybe there are patterns, we're not seeing them, so we submitted these data to a latent profile analysis. And I'm going to show you the same data, just grouped differently, and we do see different patterns emerging. These are the same exact data shown differently here by color. The people on top shown in green, so these are all people who say, I'm having serious thoughts of suicide. People in green have very low mean ideation with a few little bumps up. They're clicking on zeros and ones. People in yellow, low mean, higher variability. They have higher peaks of severe ideation. People in purple, moderate mean, moderate variability. People in red, only 4 of them, high mean, low variability. So they're persistently thinking about suicide at each assessment and never coming all the way down. And people in blue, high mean, high variability. They're equally high, but they have periods of relief where they come down to 0. Which of these groups do you think was most likely to make a suicide attempt? Any quick guesses? Blue? People in red were most likely to have made a suicide attempt before we started monitoring, suggesting maybe they're at highest risk. What we haven't done is follow these folks out over time to see who is at highest prospective risk of suicide attempts. And also, do people transition across these different subtypes or profiles, or do they tend to stay in one for a longer period of time? So there's still a lot unanswered. This is a small sample. We did this a second time in an independent sample, ran a latent profile analysis separately, and the same 5 profiles emerged, which suggests maybe these are stable, at least on the short term of 1 month, stable subtypes, but a lot more to learn here. Alan, of course, would not be happy, and I see him groaning in the front row. These are still just self-report data. I agree, Alan. More important is direct assessment of ongoing behavior. We can't just continue to rely on what people are telling us. We're zooming in, but we're still relying here on self-report. We really need to observe behavior directly in people's time and place to really understand more precisely. And so we've been trying to do that as well. So in addition to active monitoring of asking people questions, we also, with people's consent, load a passive monitoring app onto their smartphone. We collect passive data. We collect GPS data about how they're moving around the world, accelerometer data, how much are they moving about in place, what's happening call and text-wise, who are they calling, are people calling and texting them back. We're looking at the Bluetooth beacon. So GPS shows us how people are moving around space in the world. Using Bluetooth signals, we can look at how a person's moving around the environment they're in, the building that they're in, to see how activated or agitated might they be. So these are GPS data as just one example. This is for one person over 2 different days. You can imagine these data being overlaid onto like a Google map. And the first box is a person so blue is nighttime, red is daytime. The bigger the dot, the longer the person's in one place. So I apologize, the laser pointer doesn't really work on the screen. The person starts in the upper left, moves around throughout the day, and then moves back again. Second box is a different day, much less activity here than the first day. Full disclosure, these are data from J.P. Onella's research assistant, a day when she went to work, a day when she stayed home, so not so exciting on their own. But you can imagine how these data, paired with self-report data and paired with other data, might be indicative of, say, a healthy, behaviorally active person or day relative to a depressed, more isolated person or day. We're also collecting biosensor data. We're doing studies at local hospitals. This is Mass General Hospital here, where we put it's called the Empatica E4 device, sort of a beefed up Fitbit that collects continuous physiological and behavioral data from people in real time. So this one collects heart rate, electrodermal activity, skin temperature, movement, and we get these different channels of information from people in real time. And you see this little green button here. They push a button whenever they have a thought of suicide, and that puts an event marker in the data. And what we're doing now is using machine learning methods to see, can we use continuously collected data to predict when suicidal thoughts occur? And this is a paper we're writing up now. I don't have the data to show you. We're able to predict with about 80% accuracy whether a person's data from today predicts a suicidal thought on the next day while in the hospital. So still fairly small sample and still lots of false positives in our prediction, but the idea is to try and collect more and more data to get better and better at not only understanding what increases risk, but getting better able to predict it. Which brings me to the last thing I want to talk about, which is doing real-time intervention. If we can identify when someone is suicidal and when they're likely to make a suicide attempt, might we be able to beam them some kind of intervention that can help them? What we do now is if someone says they have really strong thoughts of suicide, we have a little pop-up that suggests that they call a crisis hotline. This is good, it's sort of industry standard, but we know that many people don't call the hotline when we ping them. What might we do here? Here, I knew what to do. because my dissertation was focused on exactly on this problem. It's a dissertation that's never been cited before, so I wanted to use this opportunity to talk a little bit about it. So in my dissertation, what we did was a participation enhancement intervention, and the idea was this. Setting up shop in Alan's clinic, a lot of people don't persist in treatment. They drop out prematurely, so we did a little intervention where we screened 120 families, and we identified 76 families who were eligible for participation, and then randomly assigned them to care as usual or a brief participation enhancement intervention. And what this was a face-to-face, brief, meaning 5 to 45-minute intervention, where we work with them to identify potential barriers to treatment that might prevent them from participating, and we, with a paper and pencil, help them generate plans for overcoming those barriers. This led to significant increases in, this is therapist-reported quantity and quality of parent adherence to treatment. The top lines are the treatment condition, the lower lines are the control condition. I can see by the looks on your faces you're not very excited by this. Brief, 5 to 45 minutes over 3 sessions, that's a lot of time. A randomized trial with 76 people. It's a pretty small, pretty clunky, not scalable kind of study. The look on your faces leads me to think maybe you think this dissertation didn't actually happen. How would this university possibly grant a dissertation to a person who collects data from 76 people? I have anticipated your response, and I came with evidence. This is me at my dissertation defense. This is the dissertation defense. I couldn't find the floppy disk that it is currently stored on, but I assure you those pages are my dissertation. The look of sort of shock and concern and confusion on your faces are similar to the faces expressed by my committee. This is them here, right after my defense. Alan looks sympathetic, Mitch looks shocked, Kelly looks disgusted. Peter looks happy, but my understanding is it was shortly after this that he shaved his mustache in protest that this dissertation was approved. But the dissertation was approved, which made me very happy. It made Alan happy because he was now getting rid of me out of his lab. So here we are right after the event, being happy for very different reasons. So I, at that point, left Yale and went to Harvard and started doing work, but there was this lingering concern I had about this type of intervention. And Alan sent me a secret message in this paper, Rebooting Psychotherapy Research and Practice, which became very quickly a seminal paper in the field saying, and I assume that my study was the one, the sort of straw that broke the camel's back, to say we can't keep doing that kind of research. We can't keep doing face-to-face, one-off, intensive, paper and pencil interventions. What we have to do is intervene using technology on a much larger scale if we're going to have any kind of impact and reach the people who need to be reached. And so we responded by trying to do just that. So we've teamed up with a social media platform called Coco, which is, as it describes itself, a safety network for social networks. And what this platform does is it runs in the background on social media platforms and messaging apps, for instance, on Facebook Messenger, on Kik Messenger, and it uses machine learning and artificial intelligence technology to detect words where people are saying, I'm depressed, I want to kill myself. And then it sends a bot to interact with them to push them to crisis services. So we teamed up with them to say, can we do a similar kind of study to this sorry excuse for dissertation, but on this larger scale using this rebooting approach? And so we recently completed an online randomized controlled trial of a very similar barrier reduction intervention on a larger scale, whereas in this first study we screened 120 people to randomize 76, and that took, I don't remember, 6 months, 8 months, 12 months to do so, all because of my slowness. In this newer approach, where we're working online with people on a social media platform, we screened 40,000 people and we're able to randomize about 1,500 to intervention versus control condition in about 2 weeks. So much larger scale, can reach many more people. And what we did was, similar to the intervention done in the earlier study, we worked with people, in this case with bots, and rather than 5 minutes to 45 minutes, it was like 5 seconds to 45 seconds to basically say, what kind of barriers are there to you calling this crisis service, and can we help you overcome them? And so the intervention looks something like this. This is from my phone screen. If you say, I interacted with it myself before this presentation, I said, I want to kill myself, and it said, okay, you're not alone in this. What country are you in? I said, I'm in the US. And they said, okay, here are some hotlines and some crisis text services you can contact. And then you click OK on the bottom. It then says, and this is a bot, not a person, says, so be honest, how likely are you to try the resources I just shared? Very likely or not likely? If you click not likely, now you're eligible for this randomized trial. If you get the intervention condition, you get this brief intervention. It basically says, okay, thanks for telling me. Here are some things that keep people from using crisis services. Are any of these relevant for you? Essentially, are any of these barriers for you? For instance, I just want to chat. I can't use my phone right now. I don't want the police to come. If I call crisis services, maybe the police will show up. If I click on no police, it says, most calls to crisis centers don't end with the police or paramedics showing up. This is extremely, extremely rare, like less than 1% rare for most crisis hotlines. And you click OK. That's it. That's the intervention. So what percentage of people are, when we give them crisis services, say, yeah, I'm likely to use these crisis services? Only about less than a quarter. Of the people who said I'm not likely to use the resources you just gave me, we randomized about 1,500 to get this little mini little nudge intervention versus nothing at all. We said, here's crisis services, if you're not likely to use them, okay, forget it. People who got this little nudge intervention were 45% more likely to then actually call the crisis line or text the crisis line when followed up with about 4 hours later. Which is, to me, exciting that this small little intervention, very brief, fully automated, can be so scalably used to have this kind of impact, which led our team to give each other lots of positive reinforcement in response. So given our time, I'm going to stop there, and to conclude, I want to conclude by just saying that although suicide and suicidal behaviors have been a big problem for very long, we're making some progress in this problem, towards solving this problem, and we're doing this because we're trying to do what Alan might do to make progress. And I want to end by saying thank you so much to Alan for all that you've done for me and for so many of us. Thank you. There's time for a question or two if people have any. Yes. Yes. Absolutely. Yes, and this is a big question. As we're doing more and more real-time monitoring, what do we do if someone's at risk? First, how do we know if they're at risk, and then what do we do to respond? We actually just hosted, or co-hosted with NIMH a meeting to discuss exactly this. As we're doing digital monitoring studies as a field in the area of suicide, how do we ethically respond and clinically and scientifically respond if someone's at risk? One option is to call crisis services, to call, in Boston we have what's called a BEST team. Boston Emergency Services team. Similarly, it's a mobile intervention team. You call them and they get in their, we always said van, it's actually a Prius, and they drive to the person's house and they do a little face-to-face intervention and make a determination, does the ambulance need to be called or do we need a sort of lighter touch? We can do that. About 3 to 5% of all the responses that we get on smartphones, a person says 10 out of 10, I want to kill myself. When you add it up across a lot of people, that's a lot of calls. We'd be having to make about 30 of these calls per day, given the current studies that we're doing. What we're trying to do is say, can we use that as the higher end, when we think someone's really at risk, however determined, and develop lighter touches on the lower end of the high scale, to say if we think someone's at moderate to high risk, maybe we deploy hotlines, or self-help services. If they're at the higher end, then we deploy a mobile crisis team. But I think so far, to my view, the science isn't there to say, well, when is moderate to high to imminent risk? We do that clinically, but scientifically, we're not quite sure. Yeah, great question. Yeah, Ty. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. And we actually just started doing this. We've been collecting data for about 2 years now, collecting mountains of data on people to try and predict suicidal thoughts and behaviors. And then it took you 5 minutes, it took us 2 years to say, well, we're collecting all of these data. Shouldn't we also be asking about violence and substance use and alcohol use? And we can get better at predicting lots of different things. And so we've just recently started to add those questions to our assessments. we don't have data yet, but I think hopefully we can. I think there's certainly overlapping risk factors in terms of agitation, aggressive tendencies, and so on. So hopefully we'll have a lot more bang for a buck when we incorporate those other outcomes. Great. Thank you very much.